Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Alexei and today I have a special guest, Thomas Wanasek. Joel is a wonderful mixing and mastering engineer who worked with great bands such as Machine Head, Monuments, Mayavi and many more. Also, Joel is a co-founder of Nail the Mix, the best online community on mixing metal. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel today, Joel. And let's start our interview. So, not to waste your precious time, let's start our interview. And my first question is how you became a sound engineer.
How did I become a sound engineer? Well, I started off as a musician when I was, I want to say 9 years old playing violin. And then I got into guitar when I was 13 years old. And then the first time I walked into a recording studio, and I think I was this is around 1997. It was the coolest thing ever for me. I walked in and I'm like, this is awesome. I don't know why. It had like a certain magnetism to it where it just seemed like something I was interested in doing. And then when I went to a studio the second time, I was hooked. I had to have one and I started recording myself.
So my next question is how you got into mixing metal.
Mixing metal. Well, that's an interesting question because I actually don't mix that much metal anymore. I mostly do rock. I've been doing a lot of this new wave of pop punk stuff recently, and I do a lot of pop music too, and country, actually, surprisingly. Still do a little metal, but not as much as I used to. So I was always a metalhead. I want to say from the age of 13, I was into like death metal, like traditional death metal, like Cannibal Corpse and Napalm Death and hold on, God, I'm trying to think. I'm old, so my brain doesn't work so good as it used to. Bands like that, Obituary, Morbid Angel, things like that. So I grew up listening to a lot of that. Then I got into a shred metal phase. So all I did is listen to power metal and like anything neoclassical for about 4 or 5 years and play guitar all day, 10 hours a day. I was obsessed with shred guitar and sweep picking and speed picking and things like that. So then I played in a melodic thrash band, I guess, which would be kind of like Swedish metal, if that makes sense, like Gothenburg, like In Flames and things like that. And, we were really very, very influenced by bands like Children of Bodom and In Flames and Soilwork and things like that. And then somewhere around 2007, I mean, I was recording from probably like 99, but I started actually recording my own stuff like for real and got a more serious setup in about 2003. 2005 is when I made the jump into producing full time, but I didn't really have any clientele. So about 2008, that's when I really started doing it, and I was doing a ton of metal bands. So I was always kind of a metalhead, but I when you produce bands, you end up working, well, at least for me, you end up working in a wide variety of things. So I found I enjoyed actually listening to pop music and rock music and things like that. I also did have a stint where I played in a rock band for 9 months, and we blew up and got to go on tour with Papa Roach and Buck Cherry and play arenas for 5,000 to 10,000 people for a bit. And it was pretty exciting, but then 2009 happened and no one wanted to sign rock bands anymore. It was all, dubstep and EDM and stuff like that. So yeah, I've been all over the board. Now I work on literally everything, even though I'm most known for the metal projects that I've done.
So my next question is how Nail the Mix was created.
Okay, well, this is kind of a long story. So I was producing bands in my basement and, there wasn't anybody really in my town where I live in. I kind of live in a place called Milwaukee, which is for people who aren't familiar, non-Americans, I would say that's about an hour and a half north of Chicago. And there's not much of a music scene up here, but there was a lot of like metal bands and metalcore bands at the time in like 2008, 9, 10, 11. And I was the only guy in town that knew how to do that stuff. And one day, I have a philosophy, and that's always try to give your artists more than they're paying you for. So, a lot of producers will just record the band. They will kick them out for the day and be done. That's it. You give them the money, the product. I always took the time to develop my clients and develop the relationships and coach them and teach them how to become successful. Because like I said, I had gotten on stage for, with my band and, I got to play arenas. So I've played everything from local shows to arenas. And then I started doing songwriting and licensing for sports music. And I met a guy in a very famous band, and he taught me how to build a band. And once I learned that, it made sense. And I started teaching and training bands like we'd be sitting there editing, right? And I would always give them way more value than they're paying for. I would teach them how to be successful, even though I knew that maybe 1 out of every 100 bands that would come through my door would actually have the talent and the energy to really try to do this professionally. But I still gave every band my all. So a good example is, this is how I met Joey Sturgis. I had a band show up in my studio one day, and they weren't very good, and they argued a lot. And we recorded the 2 songs Monday and Tuesday. They went to school. They showed it to their friends Wednesday and Thursday, and they broke up Friday. And one of those bands was a band called With Hours Waiting. And that band, they went to some studio in town. They paid this guy like $60 an hour. He was some older guy, didn't understand metalcore. They went to me because I was charging like $25 an hour. I mean, it's like 2008, or I want to say 2007, 8. And I did a good job for them. And they're like, well, hey, we're going to go record with this Joey guy, but we only can afford 4 days. And do you want to produce our record? And then we can have him mix it. I'm like, cool. Well, I'm self-taught. I come from a cornfield, a basement in a cornfield in the middle of nowhere. There's no real studios unless I go 2 hours to Chicago or LA or Nashville. And, I've taught myself everything. And this Joey guy, turns out that he started in his basement, or his garage, taught himself, and we both used Cubase. So when we started talking, either of us have never talked to a real producer before. And we had taught ourselves, and we were, our learning was down to like 3 things. We had Pro Sound Web, we had Gear Space, or used to be Gear Sluts back then. And there was also like the Andy Sneap Forum. That was the other place that people went. And, that was it. Like we just became friends. So I went there with the band to meet him, and we hung out, and we finished the record, and we just became best buddies because it was the first time one of us actually met somebody else who was just as passionate about this as each other. And I mean, we would record all day, and then all night we'd sit there and talk about music and producing and mixing and tell crazy stories until like 3 a.m. We'd sleep for like 4 hours, wake up and do it again. And that was it for like 5 days. So that is right when Joey had finished Devil Wears Prada, and right before he did Oceano, and he was just starting to blow up and get famous. And he was like, I've got all this stuff going on with Rise Records. I need some help. I've got a couple of bands that I need some help with mixing. So I helped them, set it up, and like we kind of team mixed a couple of projects. And, one of those being Asking Alexandria, which is crazy because 3 of those songs actually ended up being on Stand Up and Scream. And I was going to help him mix that, but I was in Russia. And I'm like, I'm not home for 3 more days. So I actually missed mixing Stand Up and Scream with him, which sucks because it went gold. But I at least got to do the 3 demo versions of Cowboy and Single Act of Serenity. And I forgot what that other song is, but it was pretty cool because, so all that stuff was blowing up for him. I was just grinding it in my own studio, working really, really hard. And, he came back to me about 4 or 5 years later, and he's like, hey, I just put a bass drop on my website and I made a ton of money. And I'm like, really? And he's like, you ever make a guitar impulse before? Because I know you know how to mic a cab, and I only use Pod Farm. I don't know how to mic a cab. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know what an impulse is, but I'll learn. So he talked to like 20 different producers about maybe making some products and stuff, because Joey had a big audience, and Joey's like a genius. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And I was like, sure. Well, I was the only guy out of all the people that he hit up, don't they feel stupid now, that did the work and turned in the product 3 days later. And we went out, we made some money. So we were, at that point, I just started to ghost mix for Joey again. And we started just team mixing everything. So, I mean, we did a ton of great records like Attila and Miss Mayavi and Blessthefall and just so many good bands. And, we developed, that's how we developed the speed mixing thing, because we were doing like 60 songs a month. I mean, I have a full-time assistant, and I was grinding it out, and Joey and I, we were mixing back and forth over email and stuff. And like, I was doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and we mixed so many bands. And we would get together and we just always talk about mixing. And we're like, why aren't we recording this one day? Like it went off. This is interesting. And I feel like people would want to listen to these conversations. So he's like, well, I know this guy, Al, and he's into podcasting, and he's done some education stuff with Creative Live. And I just did a thing with those guys over there. Why don't we do a podcast with him? So we started a podcast, which was the Joey Sturgis Forum podcast. And, it went good for a year. And everybody all of our customers were like, mixing. We want to talk about mixing. We're like, yeah, but engineering's cool, producing's cool. They're like, mixing. And we're like, okay. So we came up with a concept for Nail the Mix. There was a couple of people doing different variations of models like Graham Cochran and Mix with the Masters at the time. We looked at what everybody else's were doing and we're like, they're doing it wrong in our opinion. Like the way they do it, it's not any good. We think we should do it like this. So we came up with our own way of doing the way we wanted to do it, which was different because we incorporate the live element and all that stuff. And we put it out and oh my God, it was like an explosion. I mean, overnight, it changed our lives because it was just the right thing at the right time. And, when it's like when a band blows up, right? It's like one night they're playing in a bar and 3 weeks later they're on stage in front of 15,000 people. And it's like, it's crazy how your life changes when that happens because it's completely overwhelming. So, it was like for us, Ale had done some marketing education. So Joey and I went crazy. Like I read like 70 books. It was like doing an MBA in college and business. He invested a ton of money into learning about market. We spent so much time learning how to actually build a company because all of a sudden, unexpectedly, we're like, oh, maybe we can make a couple extra dollars or something to help supplement our incomes. Because sometimes, in producing you have ups and downs. And it just exploded to the point so fast that it was like, maybe we should stop producing bands and focus on this because we're building a real business. And we had to learn how to run a business and not just click buttons on a computer, and put limiters on things. So that was a challenge. And, now URM is a massive team of people. There's a lot of really talented people. And it's, we have a dev doing software, constantly doing website stuff. We have marketing team. We have a content team. We have, there's it takes a lot of people to run it. But again, I think it's just testament that if you have the right thing at the right time and you have enough of a brain to do it correctly and to serve the customer and to give them more value than they're paying for, you'll do something good.
The next question is, what tips can you give on saving CPU in large projects?
Yeah, I mean, that Nail the Mix. It's been a few years. I mean, I did that song in 2016. I might have done it in Nail the Mix like 2018 or 17. I don't remember. 2017, actually. That was one of our first real bands that came on Nail the Mix because when we started this thing, people were like, what? I don't want to do that. But then as soon as Machine Head did it, it was like, well, Machine Head came on and then the bands were like, oh, well, we want to be part of that too. So I got to give credit to Rob Flynn for taking that risk and, helping us. So to answer your question, I have a different take on this now than I used to. I've switched to analog in the last 2 years for a various number of reasons. And my answer was get out of the computer. But that being said, for a more direct answer, that's more useful for people. and less philosophical. There we go. Less philosophical. It's you can print your samples, right? Commit your tracks, print things. It's good to subgroup. So for example, if you have some synths or strings or things that are sometimes producers, and I don't know if I did this in a session, I might do like 4 or 5 synths that are the same kind of sound. Well, why not pre-balance those, bounce that to a single thing, and then get that processing off and get those tracks? So commit down your files, right? So any samples you have into audio, because some samples you might not like a certain kick or whatever. You might want to do some hand adjustment. Print any virtual instruments, and I just like to commit things. So if you've got DIs and you reamp, print it if you're using an amp sim, and then it's in the session, and then get rid of those tracks. So really, just good session organization and management. Honestly, that helps. The other thing is, and I think this is important, right now we're in a trend because the inherent limitations of digital mixing is something that really nobody's talking about, but everybody should. And a lot of people get mad at me when I talk about this and they come and beat me up, but they're wrong. So I'm just going to say what I think and believe. And I've done the tests. And when people question me on this stuff, I question their hearing. So, the problem with digital mixing is like analog is very additive to the sound, right? So I have a console in front of me, which you can't see, and a ton of gear and channel strips and stuff like that. And it's like if I put on a SSL 4000 channel strip, and by the way, I have a different perspective on this too, because I actually have designed and put out plugins and software. So I understand how these things are modeled and how far off the technology actually is versus what is marketed to the consumer. When I put on my SSL 4000 strips that are racked from a console, like just inserting it, you can hear a change in the sound. If you do that with the plugin, you don't. It doesn't matter if it's Brainworks or UAD. And yes, plugins have gotten better, but they don't sound like hardware. And I don't care what anybody says, they're wrong. It's like, does VR porn, is it the same as sex? Fuck no, it's not at all. You can make it look like it, sound like it, but it's not the same. You're still fucking yourself. Excuse my language. It's kind of how I feel about digital. It's like, you can take a really good photoshopped picture of an oil painting and it can look really realistic and make it 3D or whatever with 3D glasses and make it seem like you're in an art gallery. But it's not the same as going to the Tratakov Gallery in Moscow or the Pushkin State Museum or the Hermitage, right? You know exactly what I'm talking about. So there's a certain depth that gets lost in digital, and there's a certain, I call it like a softness that it sounds like, and the way that it gets bloated and like collapses in the lower mids. Like there's just a certain way the transients don't hit the same in terms of the same feeling. Like it doesn't move air the same is what I'm trying to say out of speakers. I don't know why. I can't explain it on a level of physics, but once you hear this to me is as obvious as, the fact that there's an analog console in front of my face and I can touch it with my hand. Like it's that real, and it's like when I show this to people and I compare it, they're like, wow, that's crazy. So the problem with digital is in order to overcome that, we need saturation, right? Because analog has an inherent saturation and distortion in it, which for whatever reason makes audio subjectively, more listenable. So for example, when I mix a guitar, I may need 6 freaking EQs if I'm mixing in a plugin, no matter what I do. And I know how to EQ. I've been EQing. I can mix just as good in the box as I can on hardware. I've been mixing for 25 years and I've got a number one song that I mix in a computer. So I know how to mix in digitally, because people are like, oh, well, if you don't know how to mix in the box, then you're not doing right. And I'm just like, no, fuck you. I have a number one mixing in the box. Don't tell me I don't know how to mix in the box. There are certain limitations in digital where when you're EQing, for example, you're going to have to EQ a lot more because you're going to hear all these narrow notches. When I go to an analog EQ, there's a certain distortion it adds that smooths out a lot of those little resonances and things that you would notch, or now people just use Soothe, right? They just load up the automatic correction plugin. And it's insane to me how much easier it is to mix on something like that, because while I might use 5 plugins, I can then replace it with one strip of hardware, right? And I can do it with 2 or 3 moves on that piece of hardware. And then when I try to recreate it with the plugins digitally and I punch in the exact same moves and I match it on a curve filter, it doesn't sound the same. I still have to reach for 4 more EQs because there's these little resonances and harsh, like guitars or cymbals. So it's crazy the role that distortion plays in music. So when you're processing in the box, we have to use a lot of saturation, a lot of modeling, a lot of non-linearities and things like that. And it helps a little bit sometimes, but it's the only way that we can compensate for that loss of inherent distortion that makes things just naturally sit in a space where digitally you have to fight for it. Like the way I look at it is like when I'm mixing digitally, I feel like I'm on a flat piece of paper and I can move around on that and put, it's like taking a different colored crayons. And then like, if you play it on the bass, you're going to have a big dark thing here, but then, you got to move some of that out. Like it doesn't naturally put things together in space. If I summon to an analog console, like I have an API in front of me, it's a pretty distorting sounded thing, but the way that everything just sits, you need 30%. I don't know if that's an exact number, but I'm just saying like 25 to 30% less EQ. It's just like you can raise the fader on the bass guitar and you haven't EQ'd it and you're like, wow, why does it just work 20% better in the mix? It has a way of just sorting everything out, putting things in space. And you don't get that in the computer. And it's the most aggravating thing because I want it to work in the computer so I can sell all this crap and not have to deal with it every day. Higher electric bill, higher maintenance, higher gear, But sonically, as a mix engineer, which is all I do, I'm getting paid for the quality of my results. I'm not getting paid for what's convenient for me. So we have a very large incentive cost bias to want to work in the computer because it doesn't sound as good. So we try to convince ourselves that it does, but we really know that it doesn't. It doesn't quite sound as good, but it's a lot more convenient and it's a lot more economical. So a lot of us use it. And, I reached the point in my career where I'm just like, I don't want to mess with that. So going back to your question, I know this is a long-winded tangent. I think one of the challenges mixing in the computer is the fact that you need to use so many plugins to get something to sound closer to what the way things would come together easy and natural. We got to kind of force it together in the plugin, and it's a lot more work. Because of that, we're using a lot more processing than we probably should. So sometimes when I'm mixing in a plugin, I try to use less EQ and simplify. If I have more than 3 or 4 EQ plugins, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go back and just try to do this on one. But then you start chasing little imperfections. So I try to use less processing when I'm mixing in a computer because it's hard to do. But if you can do it, I think you'll probably get better results because the natural inclination, we've been taught, this might be my fault at URM. We've been taught to use a lot of processing. And, I see this all the time when I do like a mix rescue at URM. People come in and they've got like 200 plugins in their session. And then it's just like, honestly, if I took all of this crap off and just readjusted the faders, I'd already be in a much better starting point. I see people over mix a lot because they identify a problem and they don't know how to fix it and they start stacking thing after thing after thing. When you've literally gone through thousands of student mixes like I have and critiqued them and listen, after a while you start hearing trends. And I'm in the unique position to be able to do that because it's part of my job. So I think that one trend I really notice is, especially with people that have been mixing less than like a decade or 10 or 15 years, is they tend to really overmix things because they feel like they need to put a lot of stuff on it. It's like they're going to parallel compression and parallel saturation before they even fader balance something. And they usually over EQ things and screw things up because it's not sounding the way they want. The day that I bought a console, that changed for me because mixing became a lot easier. And then all of a sudden it was like things that were really difficult to do became very easy. And I feel like it's mixing with cheat codes. It's crazy. So that's one way you can reduce CPU processing power is to try to use less in the computer and maybe reconsider. I know an analog workflow is not for everybody, but there are things like a summing mixer or a hardware bus comp that you could have a minimal investment in that will make mixing substantially easier for you and you'll use less EQ.
The song Is There Anybody Out There by Machine Head was recorded in many locations. What is advantage or disadvantage of this approach?
Okay, good question. Well, this is kind of a modern thing. Traditionally, a band would lock in with a producer, right? And they would sit down and they would do it with one engineer and they would live that record until it was done. Then it would go to a mixer and a mastering engineer and and a lot of great art was made that way. Now in the modern world, apparently we're too OCD, obsessive compulsive, or too ADD, attention deficit. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for, not obsessive compulsive. Too ADD for that sort of process. So you have people recording guitars on their tour bus, then going to another studio and recording drums, then working with another producer on this, and another person does that. And the hard part about having multiple people on a team is that there's more chance for error and suboptimal work. If you are a good team leader as a producer, which most are not, but if you're like Howard Benson, right, who is a phenomenal leader of his team, your team is going to outperform every other team every single day because you have the best engineer, the best editor, the best vocal coach, the best drum tech, the best mixer, the best mastering guy, and they're all on the same team and they all work together and everything is a really well-oiled machine. So the pros of being able to do things the modern way with like a bunch of people working on things are that if you get it right as a producer and your management skills, which most musicians are not, because and most musicians, I don't want to say all producers are musicians, but most of us played in a band and come from that sort of background. I feel like, I can't say 100%, but I would bet money. So if you come from a background like most of us, I think what will happen is that what happens is if you are good at managing people and running a team, what's going to happen is you'll be able to get your team to work together flawlessly, because any new team is always going to be, it's challenging. Like anytime we get a new person on one of our teams at one of our businesses like Drumforge or URM, it always takes a while for them to fall into place. The thing is that multiple people are better than one. I think that's why URM is very successful, because Joey AL and I, as well as the rest of our team, we all complement each other. So there are certain things I can do that they can't. There's certain things they can do that I can't. And there's certain, you know what I mean? That each one of us has like a superpower. And when we play to our strengths, we do incredible things together. And when we don't play to our strengths, it creates chaos. So, as you run a business, you get better at these things with more experience, but finding what you're good at is important. For example, a lot of younger people trying to figure out what they're doing. Like, should I be a mixer? Should I be a producer? And the answer is the market will tell you, meaning that people will hire you to do one thing and they will, keep hiring you and hiring you. And people kept hiring me to mix. Like I did good as a producer, but I've done much better as a mixer and a mastering engineer than either of those. Those are the two things I keep getting hired for. So now I just focus on those and I don't waste my time. So instead of treating it competitively, I find producers and I send them work and they send me work and we work together in a synergistic relationship. So I have a team of people, various teams of people that I mix for, that I mix on with different producers. And it's amazing because our teams are now well established and we do a lot of great work together and it's very fast. I have done a million bands though on the other side of that where it's absolute chaos. And this is the con side, meaning that the good production teams are putting out the big bands and the big artists and they're crushing it. It's much better than being a lone wolf, a one-man show or a one-woman show and trying to go up against someone like Howard Benson because he's got 6 people on his team and they're all the best of the best, or 6 to 10, right? Whereas somebody might be sitting in their studio by themselves and it's just one person. And it's like, how are you going to be a better engineer than one of the best engineers in the world, and a better mixer than one of the best mixers, and a better producer than one of the greatest hit makers of all time? You can't. You can pick one of those things and be competitive in 20 years at it if you're lucky, right? So this is a symptom now of the bad side of this, is we move into situations where people do things all over the place with teams, different people working on things, but the teams are not always optimally run and it can create a disaster. So you get drums that are tracked poorly, that are not edited correctly, that need to be redone, but there's no time to do it. You get situations where guitars are unusable, or there was noise, or the vocals were recorded in a really low quality environment. And it affects the quality of the art. So if a team is not done well, it will absolutely make a project underperform every time. But if a team approach to producing is done correctly, you will crush everybody most of the time, because there's always a bit of a luck factor to this. So, it's an interesting world we live in. You got to do what you got to do. But I am honestly, I used to be 5 years ago, I was more just whatever it takes to do it and get it to work. Where now I've kind of pivoted more in my career and life to all I care about is the highest quality possible. So I don't want to take shortcuts anymore. I don't want to use tools that are subpar. Like, I don't want somebody recording on a 7B if a 251 is the best microphone for that singer. And I would rather have them go into a studio with all of the mics and shoot it out and find the perfect mic for that person's voice for the song than, we only own this microphone, so that's all we can do. So what I'm saying is, like, I don't like to work with people that take shortcuts anymore, because I need to put my name on it, and I don't take any shortcuts because I've invested in all these tools because they've outperformed every other digital equivalent of them. And there's a certain sound that they have that I like, and my artists that hire me to mix love. So, you get that. What's cool about working in a team and being a producer is at some point you get to pick and choose the people that you want to work with. So for me, I set that bar. Like, I only want to work with producers who are brilliant, because I don't want to get crappy songs. I have guys in LA that send me songs. I'll give you an example, like Kevin Thrasher, he's a producer. Everything that guy sends me, he's like, check out this new song. We wrote this yesterday. And I'm like, wow, And then he'll send me another one the next day, be like, yeah, we wrote this. Do you think it's any good? And I'm just like, is it any good? Wow. Like, I mean, there's just people like that are just so talented that everything they do is phenomenal. And it's like, I love working with people like that because I know that if I give 110% of my energy to this mix on every song that person gives me, they already gave 110% of their energy to that production. And I feel like we have a much better chance of doing something amazing that's going to resonate with people than somebody who kind of just took a shortcut and like, well, I didn't have the equipment. I didn't have the team. I didn't have the budget. You know what I mean? And, again, this is the reality of the market. You have to compete with people that are, again, what level do you want to compete at? Some people are not trying to win the race and play at the highest national level. So again, some of this advice is maybe not for everybody, but I understand that I've gone through all cycles. I'm just relating to the experience of where I'm at now and what I'm trying to do and why I think it's important. And even if you're not at that level and you aspire to be at that level, it's important to start thinking this way.
How to prepare a metal mix for a mastering?
Okay, so how to produce, basically very simple. You want to turn in, leave everything on your mix bus. Nothing pisses me off more than in mastering when people send me their stems. I'm not mixing this for you. You're going to pay me mix rate if you want me to mix this. If you want me to master it, send me a stereo mix and leave all of your bus processing on it. I don't want to sit there and guess what compressor or saturator. I want to know whatever mix the client has signed off on. You give me that mix, okay, as a reference. Now, take the final limiter off and make sure that we're peaking at -6 dB so I can probably get it up in volume better than they're going to because I have more tools and more experience and different ways that I can get it that the person mixing it probably doesn't. So I will sit down and then get the master right. So I don't want people to take the processing off because if you take your bus compressor off, what happens to the mix? All the balances fall apart. Now suddenly I use a different compression setting because I think it sounds better. And then the artist gets the master and they're like, why are the drums louder? Or why the vocals came up too loud? Or, now they're pissed and they got to go back and do a mix revision and we wasted our time.
How guitar tone was created for Machine Head.
Okay, if this helps, now we reamp everything in-house. My assistant, and this is, again, going back to team building, my assistant, Joe, you can't see him, but he is one of the best guitar guys, in my opinion, in the entire world, or else he wouldn't be sitting next to me. He is like phenomenal at it. I mean, I feel like I'm good at getting guitar tones, but I don't like to get guitar tones. I want to mix them, right? I'm a mixer. He'll sit down and he'll come up with the sound for the band and do something unique and special. So, I'm tired of amp sims. They're great. I love them, but we've been using real amps with load boxes because I didn't have a place to mic cabs, and I've been much happier with the results of that.
What tips can you give on mixing a metal vocal?
It doesn't really necessarily matter too much, but the most important thing I think with metal vocals is aggression, and the best way to get a vocal aggressive is to absolutely remove all dynamics from it. Because what you do when you limit them really hard is you bring up a lot of that, like, that mouth noise and the breaths and like that intimate energy that makes it more emotional. So I like to limit them aggressively, and some sort of saturation is always nice, whether in parallel or on it. Getting the right EQ and then spending a lot of time de-essing, getting the right essing. I like my vocals extremely aggressive. Generally a little bit of reverb and delay, nothing special really in terms of effects. But for me, the most important is to get a good vocal. It's nice to have doubles on them, right? Because not all singers sound amazing. It's nice to have doubles. And then it's good to have, some saturation and stuff like that. So nothing like crazy, you know what I mean? Like if it's recorded correctly, it shouldn't need all that fancy stuff.
Thank you so much. So I'm out of questions because I could ask you the most important questions I wanted to ask you. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel. And thank you so much for all of your wonderful courses and videos. And thank you so much for your own personal YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
Большое спасибо, Alexei. Thank you for your time. I appreciate coming on here and happy to do it anytime again.